Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jenn. I'm the marketing director for Fantagraphics Books. Welcome to another installment of our author video series. I'm excited to have with me today Shira Spector. We are publishing her debut graphic memoir called Red Rock Baby Candy, which is coming out in March. Shira, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on the new book. It's such a stunner in every sense of the word.
Thank you.
There have been a number of graphic memoirs by women over the years, most recently by Roz Chast, Noelle Stevenson, and Belle Yang's Forget Sorrow. And I'm really thrilled that we can add your book to that list as well. I'd love to
Thank you.
start right at the beginning. Tell us what the book is about and when did you realize you wanted to write this book?
So the book is about my 10-year struggle with infertility and eventually getting pregnant, but I had an ectopic pregnancy, which is this very complex kind of miscarriage where the pregnancy fertilizes outside of the uterus. And in my case, it was outside of the fallopian tubes as well, which is where it usually happens. And so it was odd and extra. Well, all miscarriages are traumatic, but it was traumatic. And that and then how that intersected with my dad's terminal cancer diagnosis and then his eventual death. And because the book took 11 years to write, I also ended up weaving in things that were happening in my life as well. So primarily, I'm very fortunate to have been struggling with infertility and pregnancy loss at the same time as parenting my non-biological kid, who my partner gave birth to. So I talk about parenting and I talk about all that. And then because 11 years, my child also grew with the book and I chronicled that and, started out as a she and turned out to want to be a he. And so that process of his coming out and growing up and becoming a teenager with his own gender and sexual identity and that prompted a whole avenue for me to explore my own adolescent gender and sexual identity stuff. So there's a lot of that in there too. It's a lot of kitchen sink, everything.
One of the things that I really love about your book is how honest and fearless you are in talking about your life, the people who you love and who love you, and the events that have affected and shaped you. When you were writing Red Rock, how did you decide what parts of your story would be included in the book?
Yeah, and going back to your first question too about like what prompted me to write it or what inspired it, I had to. I found myself in like the worst place ever in my life. There was so much grief that my family and I had experienced, and I found it a kind of terrain that I really wanted to map. I knew there was a richness inside of it, and I also wrote it basically to save my life. Like I needed to explain what was happening to me, to myself, and to my partner, and to have a place to put it down somewhere that was I created it like kind of like a house around myself. It was a place to go with this tremendous grief, and also there was joy and there was things happening that I just needed to be able to put somewhere, and that was I really, it was burning in me. These stories were burning. I had to put them down somewhere. So that's why I made the book. And I've forgotten your second question, which was about, just refresh me.
Uh, when you were writing, how did you decide which parts of your life to
Yeah.
put into the book?
There's this brilliant quote, I think it's E.L. Doctorow, about writing a novel is like driving a car in the fog at night through the dark, and you can only sometimes see just what's directly ahead of you. And so I made the book a lot like I have a fiber background. I made a lot of quilts and um, textile pieces, and I made the book like a quilt. Like I made it first of all so that I could put it down and pick it up again, because I was also raising a little kid with my partner and I had to work all the time. And so much like a bunch of I had the stories almost like patchwork. Like I knew which stories I wanted to tell, and I had arranged them into something that so that I didn't have a heart attack and die from it. That I had a sense of what my trajectory was going to be. But I would work each patch, and then sort of play around with like, I love juxtaposition and I love texture and I love color, but it's specifically how it works in response to other things. So I worked it that way.
Mhm.
And how I decided which stories. So yeah, there were those main, like almost like jewels when you set them down in a setting for jewelry. Like I knew what the main stories were, and then what came up around them was largely improvisational, or sometimes you just start writing something and there's something else underneath it. Once you start excavating your life, you realize that, oh look, there's this whole tangly other thing attached to it, and I better cope with that as well. So, and I mean, at the beginning, I remember it sort of veering into this place where I was like, should I be telling this story? Is this the story? And a very wise friend of mine, Angel, told me that I should, think about that afterwards. That was what editing was for, and just let it all come through. And so I progressed from there, um, doing that, and and then it was evident that because I think also books have their own direction, and artwork has its own direction, and so you can have this really perfectly good idea of exactly what you're going to do. And often I do have a very specific vision for a page, for example, but then I'll start working on it and the page will have its own idea about what I should be doing. And I think it's a balance between that vision and also listening to what the art is demanding and what the story is demanding. So it's this very complex balancing of what is the story, what isn't the story. But I kind of I I played with it like music or gymnastics. Like I just kept moving with it and the hope that it would all make sense, and it feels like it does.
Thing I wanted to talk about is about your process. Your use of color is really stands out in your work, and I noticed you also have a BFA in fiber. Um, how do you use color in your comics, and how does your experience as a textile artist um, shape your illustrative work?
I love those questions. Color was funny because when I first started making the book, I was well aware that nobody knew who I was and that probably nobody would want to publish somebody who nobody knew. And it was way back in the day when the processes were different. And so, like, I had read somewhere that if you worked in black and white and you were nobody, you'd be more likely to be published because it was less expensive. So I was like, well, I better write this in black and white. And then I couldn't stand it exactly. And I was like, well, maybe I'll just use a little bit of color. I'll use color deliberately, like I'll just let, red and pink come through. And so then that constraint sort of informed part of the storytelling. And then eventually and I learned so much about black and white and how much color is is in black and white work. I taught myself a lot about form and just light and dark, and then so then color started. I was like, okay, maybe I'll be able to, convince somebody to do it if there's just like two other colors. And then eventually around that page with the hummingbird giving birth, the 50s cookbook page where I ripped up 50s cookbooks and it's a cake giving birth to a hummingbird. So that page was really pivotal because it scared me to death. I was like, what have I done? This is I've really careened off of the normative track now. And but also it felt like there was a lot of power in the particular colors and the explosion of color. And then I was just like, oh, what the hell? And then from there, I just started using color more liberally. Um, and I guess everything I try to make sure that everything in my work is meaningful and that there's a reason for it. So especially in the beginning when the color starts to come through, it's tied into the storytelling and tied into the symbolic nature of what those colors mean. And um yeah. So it was a relief to just really. I love color. I dress colorfully as well. Like I'm always looking at and for color. My first word was light. I just luminosity and texture and all that, so which segues nicely into my textile background. um I used to I have a BFA in fibers. I started out in a painting and drawing program, which was fairly conservative, and I was making cartoons and drawing these line drawings, and that was not what was happening and not what my teachers wanted me to be doing. And I ended up leaving school entirely, except for one course, which I was taking in fibers. And that department was much more contemporary, and there were feminists there, and there was a real kind of feeling of like aliveness for mixing media, and also textiles just really spoke to me. So I was printing, interestingly, comics onto fabric, and there was a whole time where I felt like things weren't real if they weren't on fabric. Like I would feel like my other drawings weren't finished until I saw them on fabric. And so now I have this weird thing happening where, well, it's not weird. I started to sort of reverse that and bring the textile to the paper. And yeah, I don't know, I went off on a fever dream there, but yeah, so textiles, I mean, they're everywhere, they're part of everything. I love pattern, I love costume, and I wanted to bring that. I felt like I needed to bring all the tools I had to making this book. I wanted to tell this story so badly with the richness it deserved for everybody who doesn't get to talk about grief and infertility and pregnancy loss and all those squishy, horrible things that nobody's allowed to talk about. I wanted to bring the sensibilities of a children's book to this book, like where you get that, like, I, you know, that there's something to look for after you look once, that there's layers and that there's deliciousness. So what I knew how to do was do that with fabric. I knew about layering translucency and embellishing a surface after you've printed on it. And I knew about, you know, a technique called duvoret, where you pull away from the fabric so there's, you know, a rupture in it. And so I just brought that to the paper. And when I started to interface with the paper like it was fabric, as opposed to the fabric like it was paper, I found something really amazing.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it really comes through in the book, on the page. Every composition, every illustration, it really has this sort of richness and texture to it. It's very tactile,
Yeah.
your artwork. And it really does lend itself to the telling of your story. Because, you know, life isn't easy. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of difficult things that, you know, people don't always want to talk about, and that's what makes you know, this book so brave. You know, it's the telling of the story and all of its ups and downs, but then also the way it's told as well.
Thank you. That means so much to me. I'm really glad it came through. I spent a lot of time crying over these pages. There was a lot of like, and tearing the pages sometimes. Like I felt each one of the pages. Like I felt my way through the book. So it's spooky and cool that it comes through. Like it's an interesting energetic experiment that you can pour that into a book and then somebody can pick it up and feel it. So it's amazing. It's the most magical thing.
Yeah, that energy definitely comes through. We do have a couple of slides, and I did want you to sort of delve a little bit more into your process. So, do you want to?
Sure. So my work starts out with text usually. One of the questions people always want to know is, do you get the images and the words together, or are they separate? So for me, they often start off as text. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to be able to sit down at a computer like I did here, and write all the garbage I need to write. Other times it's like really inopportune and I have to grab whatever's around, like, oh, this old toilet paper roll that's almost finished will do fine. So in this case, in the best possible scenario, I'm working with text on a computer, and then I'll look at the page and start highlighting it and making notes and playing with it. And um, so I reckon with that first, like it's the first step. And then in the next slide. So this is a thumbnail sketch in pencil, and I often will start to have images that I know need to be part of the text, but it's really amazing and interesting to be able to pull a sentence apart sometimes across several pages. Like sometimes one word is a whole image, and other times there'll be big chunks of text. So this is just an example of um, just one of my thumbnails, which I pulled out of my pile of thumbnails because I think that it demonstrates well how often it looks a lot like the end result, except for not. So if you just go to the next one. So yeah, there's the final piece. And so a lot of that kind of translated. But like I was saying before, I'm always playing with what what the story is asking of me and what the page is asking of me. Is you have to listen really carefully to what the page is asking of you. And then, like the flower images in the right bottom showed up, unintended, like without my permission. And I was like, all right, fine, you can stay. And then the next one. Oh, so this is an example of how I use the actual page of text. So in that first image, I showed you one of my computer text pages. This page is an actual piece of text that I was working with, and I think I spilled ink on it, or it looks like I did. And it kicked around for a really long time, and I was really like entranced with the way it felt, and eventually I turned it into a page. So I thought that was interesting how I kind of I'll sort of use anything that gets in front of my path. Like I put underwear in the book. There's like an actual pair of underwear in this book because it needed to be there. So that's an example. And then the next one. So yeah, so here's another. This is me working with text that was like a ordinary printed typewriter. I'm so old. An ordinary piece of text from a computer. I don't know. I feel like I'm using all the wrong terms, but sometimes I feel like I need to, in this case, I was working a lot with the text and I knew it was going to be heavily part of the image. And so I ended up like writing it just to kind of feel the shape of it and playing with which parts were going to stay in and which parts weren't. And then in the next image, so there's the final image, and it turned out that I only used a very small amount of that long text. And this is an example of how, look at, oh, did I give you the sketch for that one? Well, maybe I didn't. Anyway, in the thumbnail, which I may not have included, I'm so sorry, you'll see that I always knew that there would be googly eyes in the eyes. Like I knew it would be a field of googly eyes. Googly eyes matter a lot to me. And also that the mouth would be full of rhinestones. So that translated directly. But then stuff that happened at the bottom, the transparency, the words on top of the wrapping paper, the baby, that sort of 1950s baby image, that happened afterwards. I didn't expect it to. And I had done a sort of study of the uterus and the bee in the uterus. I knew I wanted to do that as well, but it also took its own sort of form once it was on the page. That one was hard. I did a lot of like moving things around a lot, like when you're making a quilt or a puzzle. I did a lot of like with that one. There you go.
So one of the things that I also really love about the book is that it really is, it's so tactile and it's so uh, really draws you in as the reader, and it's really it's like experiencing a work of art. And so my last question for you is, experiencing art and creating comics has in many ways help us better understand everyday life, and how life can be extraordinary sometimes. How has comics and creating this book changed your life?
Yeah. Well, art. I mean, art is everything. It's sort of this language that is primary to me, and it's where I went when I needed to figure stuff out. Like, I don't know how much more twisted I'd be if I wasn't able to find a place to put all of this stuff. Um, it's, we live in a world that is really intolerant of grieving for more than the allotted amount of time, which is usually like 5 working days. And it's not containable like that. And we live in a culture that doesn't know what to do about grief, and it certainly doesn't know what to do with the grief of infertility and the grief of miscarriage, and it certainly doesn't make space for it in ways that resonated for me. When, when this happened for me, I went looking for other people who had been through similar things. I'm a feminist, and I'm a lesbian, and I'm a community gal, and I wanted resources, and I wanted company. And there was silence, and it was odd to me. And so I feel like I needed to put this in the world for myself, but also for other people, just to this thing that, like, if I could make something out of my pain that would comfort somebody, just one person in the middle of their night on their couch, tired of, you get tired of, like, crying in front of the people who love you, because how much can they do? So that's where art took over for me. That was where, like, where I just felt like, if my poor, partner has to hear this one more time, or manage my grief one more time, like, it's not fair. And so I made this place for myself, and I made this place in the world that I wasn't finding, this place of burial, but also this place of celebration. And you find gratitude in it too. Like, being alive is such a wondrous thing, and I wanted that to come through as well. So yay for art, and yay for Fantagraphics for rescuing this, from obscurity, and letting it travel as far as it has and will. And yay for my agent Nikki Richardson for believing in me, and my family and my friends who sustained me through this whole process of, I had this weird little project I was doing for a decade, and everybody kept believing. So yeah, so comics and art, it's all the same for me. It's life-saving.
Mhm.
And I hope that this book encourages everybody else who's made anything to keep doing it, and to just, you don't really have a choice in a lot of ways. There was a point where I worried this book wasn't going to get picked up, and I had to really, I walked into my friend Sarah and Emily's living room, and I was like, I don't know if this is going anywhere. And the question was always like, well, then what? Will I keep doing it? And the answer was yes, which is like something else, because but so yeah, I just hope that everybody keeps going forward with their work and their stories, and telling them the way that feels resonant and right to them, and breaking rules sometimes. And yeah, I hope that becomes a little beacon of light as well.
Agreed. And
I don't know if I answered your question. I think I went off
I agree.
my Academy Award speech. And I would also like to thank.
Well, it really brings, it really says something that these kinds of narratives need to be told, not just for the artist and the cartoonist doing the work, but also these stories need to be out in the world. It doesn't matter if they're difficult, or people don't want to talk about them. Every story needs to be told, and every story
Agreed.
deserves to be told. And this is one example. And I can tell you that we are very happy to be publishing it. So it's very exciting, and we're excited for you too. Um, Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Shira,
Okay.
thank you so much for tuning in and talking with us today. Um, Again, Red Rock Baby Candy by Shira Spector comes out on March 23rd. Thank you all so much for tuning in and watching our video, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care, everybody.